Hello and welcome to Daily Prelims Practice, where we take up the questions from the Hindu and Indian Express and curate them as per the demands of Civil Services Prelims Examination. The topic of today's discussion are listed on your screen. Moving on to the first article of the day that has featured in the Hindu, basically talks about the Janjatiya Gaurav Divas, which was celebrated, and on the occasion of which President Murmu took part in the celebration, and this event also marks the birth anniversary of tribal icon and freedom fighter BIRSA Munda. Now UPSC in the previous year has already asked questions related to BIRSA Munda, and thus this area becomes important from the perspective of prelims. The practice question in this regard says, which of the following statements are correct regarding BIRSA Munda? The first statement here is, he was known as Dharti Aba. Now this statement is correct, as BIRSA Munda was also known as Dharti Aba and is known to have mobilized the tribal community against the British and had also forced the colonial officials to introduce laws protecting the land rights of the tribals. The second statement here is, he campaigned against the British for destroying traditional Kunkhati system. Now this statement is again correct. BIRSA Munda analyzed that Mundas were suffering due to three major policies. The land policies of the British were destroying their traditional land system. Hindu landlords and moneylenders were taking over their land, and the missionaries were criticizing their traditional culture. Due to the feudal zamindari system that was introduced by the British in the Chota Nagpur region, it destroyed the tribal Kunkhati system. Kunkhati means the joint holding of land by the tribals. Moving on to the third statement, it says Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act 1908 was passed as the outcome of Ulgulan movement that was started by BIRSA Munda. Now this statement is also correct, as the Ulgulan or the Great Tumlut movement forced the colonial government to introduce laws so that land of tribals could not be easily taken over by the Dikus, and for this purpose Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act in 1908 was passed. The question for the says select the correct answer using the code given below, and as all the statements are correct, the correct code for the given question is option D. Further, the correct question for the previous year question is also option D. Moving on to the second article of the day that has appeared on the Hindu, basically talks about No Money for Terror Forum, which is scheduled to be held in Delhi this year. Now UPSC in the previous year has also asked questions related to various international organizations, their summits, and also the important initiatives that have been introduced by the organizations, and thus this area becomes important for us, as such a question was asked in the year 2015 regarding the Fort Laser Declaration. Now practice question in this regard says, which of the following statements are correct regarding No Money for Terror conference? The first statement here is, it is organized by Interpol in coordination with investigative agencies of the respective countries. Now this statement is incorrect, as the No Money for Terror conference is organized by financial intelligence units FIUs of over 100 countries, which are jointly called the Egmont Group. Further, the Egmont Group was created to provide FIUs around the world a forum of exchange of information confidentially to combat money laundering, financing of terrorism, and other predicate offenses. The second statement here says its aim is to address the challenges in countering terror funding, which we have already seen, obtained via formal as well as informal channels. This statement is correct. The third statement here says the inaugural edition of this conference was held in Paris. Now this statement is also correct, as the inaugural edition of No Money for Terror conference was held in Paris in 2018 for the first time. The conference was to take place in India in 2020 but got delayed due to pandemic. So statement 3 here is also correct. The question for the says select the correct answer using the code given below, and as only statement 2 and 3 are correct, the correct code for the given question is option B. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is also B. Moving on to the next article that has featured in the Hindu, talks about the widening deficit of India, as India's trade deficit has widened to $26.91 billion in the last month on the account of shrinking exports. Now in our previous discussion, we have already taken various questions related to current account deficit and other different deficits. And this area is also important, as UPSC in the year 2015 has asked about the budget deficit. The practice question in this regard says, consider the following statements. The first statement here is, the excess of total expenditure over total receipts including borrowing is called the fiscal deficit. Now this statement is incorrect as including word is not correct here. Rather, it should be excluding, which means the excess of total expenditure over total receipt excluding the borrowings is called as fiscal deficit. Further, the fiscal deficit gives the amount needed by the government to meet its expenses. Thus, a large fiscal deficit means a large amount of borrowings. Simply put, a fiscal deficit is a measure of how much the government needs to borrow from the market to meet its expenditure when its resources are inadequate. Moving on to the second statement, it says the difference between total revenue expenditure and total revenue received is called as primary deficit. Now this statement is again wrong as this definition is of revenue deficit. The difference between the total revenue expenditure and the total revenue received is known as revenue deficit. Primary deficit is the fiscal deficit of the current year minus the obligations of the interest payment on previous borrowings. While fiscal deficit represents the government total borrowings including the interest payment, primary deficit on the other hand shows the amount of borrowing excluding the interest payments. Now the question further says which of the statement given above is or are correct, and as none of the statement given above are correct, the correct code for the given question will be option D. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is option A. Moving on to the next article of the day that has featured in the Indian Express basically talks about India's net zero strategy and the commitments that were made at the COP27. Now, green hydrogen was particularly in news as India has made claims regarding the same. Now, UPSC in the previous year has asked about various initiatives that have been taking place in the field of environment, and thus this area becomes important for us. We need to understand the core concept related to carbon and also the other events that are in news, for example, like that of green hydrogen. As UPSC in the year 2021 only has asked about the blue carbon. The practice question in this regard says, consider the following statement. The first statement here is, blue hydrogen is a zero carbon fuel. Now this statement is incorrect, as blue hydrogen is produced from natural gas, where the emissions are captured using the carbon capture and storage. However, the blue hydrogen starts with converting methane to hydrogen and carbon dioxide by using heat, steam and pressure. The process of production of the blue hydrogen takes a large amount of energy, and according to researchers, this is generally provided by burning more of natural gas. Hence, it is not a zero carbon fuel. The statement 2 here says brown hydrogen is not a zero carbon fuel as the emissions are released into the air. Now this statement is correct, as brown hydrogen is produced using coal where the emissions are then released to the air. And here only we'll understand the difference between brown hydrogen and that of grey hydrogen, as grey hydrogen on the other hand is produced from natural gas and the emissions are there also released to the air. The third statement here says green hydrogen is a zero carbon fuel made by electrolysis using renewable energy. Now this statement is again correct. Green hydrogen is a zero carbon fuel which is made by electrolysis using renewable power from wind and solar to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. This green hydrogen that is produced can be utilized for generation of power from the natural resources. And this will be a major step forward in achieving the net zero emission guarantee. However, at present, less than 1% of hydrogen produced is green hydrogen. The question further says, which of the statement given above is or are correct? And as only statement 2 and 3 are correct, the correct code for the given question is option B. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is option A. Moving on to the next article that has featured in the Indian Express basically talks about the ARTEMIS program. Now UPSC under the science section has continuously asked questions related to various space missions from India and also from that of the world, and such a question was also seen in 2014. So this area becomes important from the perspective of prelims for us. The practice question in this regard says, with reference to Artemis 1 mission, consider the following statement. The first statement here is, it is being led by NASA, European Space Agency and ISRO. Now this statement is incorrect, as the Artemis program is a robotic and human moon exploration program led by NASA with three partner agencies being European Space Agency, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency or JAXA, and the Canadian Space Agency, but not ISRO. The second statement here says it is an orbital mission, but it has returned to Earth target. Now this statement is correct. The third statement here says this mission will take up humans to Jupiter by 2030. Now this statement is again incorrect, as the program or the mission's long-term goal is to establish a permanent base camp on Moon and facilitate further human mission to Mars. As a matter of fact, Artemis 1 is unmanned and intended to test the rocket and Orion space capsule in which astronauts will ride on the future mission. The question further says, which of the statement given above is or are incorrect, and as statement 1 and 3 are incorrect, the correct code for the given question will be option C. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is option B. Moving on to the last question of the day, the article has featured in the Indian Express and talks about the India's road to net zero status. Now, India's road to net zero status will involve techniques using carbon sequestration and reducing the imprint of carbon as a contributor to climate change. Now, UPSC has asked questions related to the same in the previous years under the environment section, and such a question regarding carbon sequestration and emissions of carbon dioxide was seen in the year 2017. The practice question in this regard says, consider the following statements regarding carbon. The first statement here is, the amount of carbon on Earth is continuously increasing due to the burning of fossil fuel. Now this statement is incorrect. The amount of carbon on Earth has never changed, but where carbon is located is constantly changing. It flows between the atmosphere and organisms on Earth as it is released or absorbed. This cycle is known as carbon cycle, and as a process was balanced for the thousands of years. The second statement here says, blue carbon designates carbon that is fixed via rivers across the world. Now this statement is again incorrect, as the blue carbon refers to the organic carbon that is captured and stored by the world's oceanic and coastal ecosystem, mostly by algae, seagrasses, macroalgae, mangroves, salt marshes and other plants in the coastal wetland. Further, the term blue carbon was for the first time coined in 2009 to highlight the contribution of coastal vegetated ecosystem to the climate change mitigation. As oceans cover 70% of the planet, there has been a birth of new industry interest in developing the blue carbon potential. The question further says, which of the statement given above is or are correct, and as none of the statement given above is correct, the correct code for the given question will be option D. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is also option D. So these were the questions for the day. Stay tuned for more such updates.